In this tutorial, we will cover the topic of legislation, the basics. Legislation as it relates to real estate of high importance as we as real estate agents are going to be either selling people's properties or managing people's properties, and these are worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. So understanding how to apply legislation to ensure that we know what we're doing and we minimize losses is of high importance. There are three levels of government that make our laws, bylaws and regulations in Australia. We have federal, which deals with nationwide. We're looking at Commonwealth legislation, so things like trade, defence, health. If we're looking at specifically relevant to real estate, things like Privacy Act, discrimination falls under this category. Then we also look at state and territory parliaments, which deal with legislating for the state, so things like schools, police, roads, health, but also real estate is at the state level as well. And then finally we have our local councils, which deal with our local laws, so things like our planning, building approvals, whether or not you can subdivide a block of land is going to come down to the local councils. What are laws? So broadly, laws are a combination of the Commonwealth legislation or federal legislation, state and territory legislation, and also common law, or also known as case law. The answer to a legal question may be found in one or more of these laws. It will not necessarily be found in only one legislation. The legislative framework. The legislative framework is made up of the following types of laws. So we have our statute laws. So these are laws that are made by Parliament at both the federal and state level. And basically they're written laws that state what you can and cannot do and need to be followed. Then there is also common law, which are laws that are set by our precedents, meaning that in the past there has been a case, that's why it's also known as case law. It's been a case that's been in front of a judge and a judgment has been made within that case, and now we need to apply that judgment to any new cases that we're going to be looking at. And contract law is voluntary acceptance by agreement. So when we are buying and selling houses in real estate, we do that on what's called a contract for sale of house and land. So we have parties, the buyers and sellers, that agree to certain terms and conditions, and also the monetary amount for which they're going to exchange the property, and that's done on a contract. And contracts can be both written and verbal, but in real estate we do not want to do anything that's verbal, because it's very easy for someone to deny that they've had knowledge of that. So that's why we do everything on a contract in writing. What is legislation? Legislation consists of laws made by Parliament or by people who are given power by Parliament to make laws, such as the Governor. Broadly, there are two kinds of legislation, and that are acts and subsidiary legislation. These are what we refer to as statute laws. Okay, so let's look at acts first. These are laws Parliament has enacted. Sometimes acts are called Acts of Parliament. Less often they're called primary legislation to distinguish them from subsidiary legislation. Usually they have the word act in their title. An act has to be read with subsidiary legislation that has been made using powers in the act to make it. Subsidiary legislation will often fill in the details not covered by the act which is made, and not all acts have or need subsidiary legislation. Sometimes these are also called delegated legislation or subordinate legislation. Subsidiary legislation does not have the word subsidiary legislation in its title. They can have other names such as regulations, local laws, bylaws, planning schemes, rules. These are laws made by people using powers that Parliament, by means of its act, has given them. The common law. Common law is law made by the courts by means of decisions they make in cases they decide, sometimes also called case law, or laws set a precedence. You might have someone who comes to the real estate office and they trip over the front mat. You can't just go to the legislation and look at what happens if someone trips over the front mat in an office. Instead, you would look under common law to look at, have there been previous cases that have been before the courts where someone has tripped over a mat in a real estate office and been in front of a judge where a judge has made a ruling in the case, and then the result of that is applied to get a similar result in the new case. Legislation and common law exist side by side, and if there are any conflicts between legislation and common law, then legislation prevails over the common law. The legislative process. This can be rather complex and can take quite a long time for the process to occur. However, for the purpose of the module, we're going to have a look at a very basic view of the process that legislation goes through to be made. First step is an issue is identified, and so a policy is then put forward to Parliament. Stage 2 is, if it's accepted, then a draft bill will be developed. This will then proceed to a series of readings where the first reading will introduce the draft bill to the House, through to subsequent readings that will occur to review and debate the bill and vote it. If it's voted upon, it will move then to the next stage of getting the royal assent from the Governor-General, and whereby then becoming an act. Acts and regulations in real estate. There are a number of acts, both state and federal, that will impact on duties performed by an agent. It is imperative that anyone working in a profession today understands the legal requirements when dealing with consumers. All acts are available for viewing on the internet or can be ordered through government print agencies. Further tutorials will look at how to access this legislation. Reading legislation. Legislation is quite complex. It needs to be read slowly, carefully, and methodically if a reader is to understand it properly. Skipping words is not advisable. It assumes that readers have a copy of the Interpretation Act and will read it to assist in the understanding of reading the required legislation. It also assumes that you have read all the legislation that the Act refers to within it. It's advisable that if people disagree, or if you don't have an understanding of what the legislation means, you should get legal advice. Common interpretation problems. Due to legislation's complexity, there are a number of common interpretation problems that readers face. Ambiguous words and legal jargon. English words and sentences constructed of such words do not always mean the same thing to everyone. Communications in English are imperfect, and for those reasons, any one piece of legislation might mean different things to different readers. Broad phrases. Paragraphs that continue on for long periods of time. Need for words to be implied, or you need to imply the meaning of words from reading the definitions within the legislation that do not always have its common everyday meaning. You can also have printing and drafting errors, unforeseen developments such as changes in technology or practice, and also you must access and read legislation to which is referred in the legislation, as well as any amending legislation, to ensure that you are compliant and understand it in full. How to access legislation. We will look at this in a lot more detail in subsequent tutorials, but from the basic level, to access legislation, you first need to know whether the legislation is federal legislation, and if it is relevant to the Commonwealth or federal legislation relevant to all of Australia, you can obtain any pieces of legislation directly from www.legislation.gov.au. Or if it is state legislation, then it's the same, but you do have to add in the code for the state. So if I was looking at New South Wales, that'll be legislation.nsw.gov.au, or Queensland, which would be legislation.qld.gov.au, or Victoria, which would be legislation.vic.gov.au. So if you head to those links, you can then from there look up the name of the act that you need to access so that you can read it. Another way to access legislation is to use a tool called Legify. It's a tool that helps you find the authoritative or as close to authoritative as possible version of almost 14,000 Australian acts and regulations instantly and direct from the legislative publishers of Commonwealth, state and territories. This allows you to simply enter in some keywords of the types of legislation that you're looking for, and it will come up with the search results for all of the Commonwealth and all states for you to choose from, and then we'll use the links to take you to the authoritative as possible version of this legislation. So it's a very good tool to use, particularly for beginners when you are searching for some legislation. How to know what legislation to read. Deciding on what legislation to read depends on what you want to know. The titles of various pieces of legislation give an idea of what they are about, and the contents pages will give the reader an idea of what is covered in the legislation. People often read legislation because they are looking for the answer to some question and not because they want to understand the legislation as a whole. The reader, however, will often have to get to understand all or at least a significant part of the legislation in question, or indeed other legislation that has a direct effect, to get a full answer. All answers to questions raised by legislation will be found in either a provision itself or the piece itself. Some answers might be either in other legislation or in case law, and some questions will not be answered clearly by either legislation or case law. The interrelationship between pieces of legislation. Individual pieces of legislation sit among other individual pieces of legislation, some of which have an effect on the target act. An act and its subsidiary legislation will stand alone and won't have an effect on other legislation unless there is an effect, in which case it will be stated in the non-targeted legislation or the other legislation. The effect of other legislation that the Act has may be to answer questions not answered in the target Act. Interpretation Acts. Each state has an Interpretation Act that provides an aid to interpreting legislation, overcoming some of the issues and problems relating to the interpretation of legislation in that state generally. Interpretation Act outlines what parts of the document are in fact and are not in fact part of the law. Words and phrases defined. If the legislation you are about to read does not define a word or phrase that it uses, the Interpretation Act might. If neither the subject legislation nor the Interpretation Act defines the word or phrase, it has its ordinary everyday meaning unless case law gives it another meaning. Although the Interpretation Act defines various words and phrases and has rules about how to read legislation, any or all of it can be and sometimes is overwritten by individual pieces of legislation. Parts of speech and grammatical forms of them. The Interpretation Act deals with this. For example, if the verb sell is defined, that definition will apply also to the verb's tenses that use sold, to the nouns sale and seller, and to the verbal noun and adjective selling. Gender and number. He, as an example, includes she, etc., and cat includes cats, and cats includes cat, etc. Internal references. Its effect is that if an act refers to Part 6, then it is referring to Part 6 of said act, not Part 6 of another piece of legislation, unless the act says the reference is to Part 6 of something else. Conjunctions. The conjunctions most often used are and or. Usually and will be between, say, two paragraphs, which means both have the effect at the same time. So if M believes A and B, M must do X means M cannot do X unless M believes A and B. Basic rules for interpretation. Often the only way to understand an act's purpose is to read it from cover to cover and get a feel for what it's trying to do. The long title and any purpose or object's provision will not contain the full answer. Legislation seldom explains why it was enacted. The reason why legislation was enacted is usually explained during the process of enacting it. To understand the purpose of legislation, it is sometimes useful to read what was said when it was being enacted. The person introducing the bill, usually a government minister, explains to the Parliament why it is being introduced and what it proposes. The Act has to be interpreted in such a way as to give effect to its purpose or object. Interpreting legislation in such a way as to give effect to its purpose or object is called the purposive approach. So if legislation is not clear on what it is saying, the reader has to try to work out what its purpose or object is. Then the reader has to interpret it to give effect to the purpose or object. Understanding what its purpose or object is may be helped by things such as the long title in the Act. Structure of legislation. A well-structured act will often make it easier to read and make it easier for readers to find things. Some acts are more structured than others. The table of contents. Scanning the table of contents is a good way to get a quick, broad idea of what the act is about. Parts, divisions, and subdivisions. Modern acts are often divided into parts, with parts being divided, if needed be, into divisions, and divisions, if need be, into subdivisions. They are all numbered and have a short description of the subject concerned in the heading. Dividing an act into parts, etc., allows sections to be grouped according to their subject. Section. The lowest level of the structure shown in the contents pages is the section. Sections have numbers and headings. Schedules. Some acts have one or more schedules at the back which, if need be, will be subdivided. Schedules may contain lists or forms or provisions that do not fit easily in the earlier portion of the act. Provisions in schedules are usually called clauses and are usually numbered. Long title. Only acts have long titles. Subsidiary legislation does not. Long titles of acts appear on the first page after the contents pages. Long titles begin with an act and explain briefly the act's purpose. Short title. This is likely to be Section 1 in the Act. It simply gives the name of the Act, which includes the year in which it was enacted, in the same way as the title page of a book says it's called, say, Moby Dick. Commencement. Commencement is likely to be in Section 2 and says when the Act commences, or put another way, comes into operation. With a couple of exceptions, an Act has no effect before it commences. If an Act is amended, the amendments operate from the day on which the amending Act says they operate. Purpose. Some acts have a section setting out the act's purpose or objects. In an act, such a section would be additional to its long title. Application. Some acts have a section saying what it applies to. Sometimes a part or a division of an act will have a section saying what the part or division applies to. Definitions. A section containing definitions of various words or phrases used in the act is usually near the start of the act. Headings of such sections vary. Some say interpretation, others definitions, others terms used. Occasionally, definitions are in a glossary at the back of the act, which is referred to in a section near the front. When starting to read an act, it is often useful to scan the various words or phrases that are defined to get some idea of what words and phrases are given special meanings. The purpose of defining a word or phrase is usually to give it a meaning which differs from its ordinary, everyday, current meaning, either to exclude some meaning it would ordinarily have or to include some meaning it might not always have, or to include some meaning it might not have ordinarily, or to explain a word or a phrase that readers might not be familiar with. If a word or phrase is defined for, say, only a section, the definition applies only in that section. So if the word or phrase is used outside that section, that definition of it does not apply in those other places unless any of them clearly say it does. If an act defines a word or phrase, the definition applies also in the subsidiary legislation made under the act. Structure of a section. A section consists of a number, a heading which is not part of law, and its words. Subsection. A section's words may be divided into two or more subsections. Subsections are usually each numbered 1, 2, etc. in brackets. Each subsection usually consists of one sentence. Paragraph. A subsection, or a section without subsections, may contain two or more paragraphs. Paragraphs are usually each numbered A in brackets, B in brackets. Between the paragraphs will usually be a conjunction such as and or, but not always. Subparagraphs. A paragraph may contain two or more subparagraphs. Subparagraphs are usually each numbered I, two I's. Between the subparagraphs will usually be a conjunction such as and or, but not always. References to sections. A section may have references to another section which needs to be read in order to get a clear understanding of the section's meaning. Amending legislation. Legislation is often amended after it is enacted. The reasons for amendments are many and varied. Very little legislation is perfect, and it is human nature to want to change things. Acts can only be amended by another act, and subsidiary legislation made under an act can only be amended by another piece of subsidiary legislation made under the act. If legislation has been amended, each provision that has been amended has a note in italics that says what amended it. To find out exactly what was done to a provision that has been amended, the reader has to go to the legislation that made the amendment. Repealing legislation. From time to time, the operation of legislation needs to be discontinued, perhaps because it's being replaced by new legislation or because it is no longer needed. That is done either by repealing the entire piece or deleting the bits of it that are not wanted anymore. Repealing legislation is usually done by enacting another piece of legislation that does the repeal. But some pieces of legislation contain a provision that says when the legislation ceases to operate, or put another way, when it expires. Interpreting legislation, specialist advice. As an agent, you need to know and understand how to interpret and apply the governing legislation. In order to fully understand relevant legislation, you may need to seek guidance from the statutory body who enforces the Act, or relevant industry association groups or legal practitioner who specialises in the field. If in doubt, always go to get specialist advice so that you can be sure that you are applying legislation correctly to your day-to-day real estate activity.